Ray Schulman, Young Transportation Safety. So I have a data transfer question about method, moving beyond the Bluetooth that we've discussed. So what is the data transfer method the officers will use, different types? What will this look like? Will the officers be able to log into the vendor systems or what?
The data transfer methods are described in the rule itself, and the vendors themselves are responsible for implementing those methods. There's no login to the vendor systems at all. The data transfers go from either the ELD device or a back office system. How that actually gets implemented is down to the vendor. To FMCSA in one of four ways. There's a USB data transfer, which is basically we have an encrypted USB device. It plugs into the ELD. There's a process by which the ELD output file gets generated, transferred to that USB device. The inspector takes that, plugs it into a computer, and loads the ELD data file on a laptop. Then there's a Bluetooth method, which is basically the inspector makes internet connection available to the ELD itself. It's a pairing process. It's like anything else. You type in a 4-digit code. It shares its internet connection. It transfers. Then the ELD will then transfer the data to FMCSA systems. There's a kind of a code that the inspector will give the driver that kind of routes it to them. It's called the output file comment in the specification. And then that file would go to FMCSA, and then the roadside inspector would have a method to retrieve that file, either into a software onto their, basically into a piece of software on their laptop as well. And the final two methods are email and web services. Email is an encrypted. Email is a little bit of a confusing one. It isn't an email to the inspector. It's an email to a specific FMCSA email address. It's an encrypted email. It's not something that you could pop up in Gmail or Outlook and something and look like. If you get one of these emails, it will look like a nonsensical email. It'll be email with a from, and that's it. It'll be from, and then this nonsensical attachment. And basically, that's going to go to FMCSA's centralized email address. It'll get decrypted, verified, sent through the same methodology down to the roadside inspector's Bluetooth, and then finally web services, which is a method whereby the ELD device uses its own internet connection, connects to a web service that FMCSA hosts, transfers data to that web service. There's a whole validation and verification routine that happens, and then that data is delivered to the roadside inspector using software that they have on their laptop.
You got all that?
How long will that take?
Yeah.
How long will
that process you described of the email to the encryption to the server, how long will that take?
to get from the ELD device to the roadside inspector?
Yes.
Depending on the process, which method's being used, it can vary. I mean, USB is kind of pretty direct. It's the email process will be probably the slowest besides USB because there's some walking involved. But the email process, we'll be continuously monitoring the email box. It's not like somebody's having open it on their computer. It's a computer checking it. But there is going to be a delay because maybe we check that email box every 30 seconds or so, do the decryption routine, and send it down to the roadside inspector. So an email might take a minute or so. The hope is that the other methods would be almost instantaneous. But that's close enough.
Yeah, and to kind of just to kind of tell you what's in the rule. He gave a very good descriptive picture of everything every scenario, every method that we have in the regulation. But to kind of put it in a regulatory perspective, that ELD only has to support. There's two options within this transfer method. So that would be the web services or the local, just as he described. Now, the ELD itself doesn't have to support all of that. So this is something to keep in mind when you're shopping. You do not have to have telematics. If you don't have telematics, you got to support the other. So the ELD either has to support telematics or it has to support local. Now, there's two methods within each of those options. So if you support telematics, you have to support the email and web services. If the ELD supports local, it has to support the Bluetooth and the USB. So it doesn't have to support all of those methods. Now, when that goes over to the state enforcement, what they have to do is they have to select one method within both options. So the provider can select either or. The state has to select one method from each option. So if the state within telematics, if they don't want to use email services, then they're going to select web services. So when within the regulation, it states that it has to be a one-step compilation for that driver. That doesn't mean that the driver's just going to push one button and that's it. That one-step compilation means the driver doesn't have to go and say, okay, I need day number 1, I need day number 2. It's a one-step compilation for that ELD transfer file. Then, as he mentioned, the driver may have to put in a code and then hit enter to send it. So that's kind of how that method is going to go. Of course, he explained in detail how each one of those methods is going to work. So that just kind of gives you in the nutshell, in the regulation requirements for the ELD, and then the requirements for the state of how that's going to work. So it doesn't have to support all 4, although if you look at the ELD registration site and you go to each of those providers, a lot of those are on there that are going to be supporting both of those options. They don't have to, they just have to select one. So you don't have to have, an ELD with telematics and pay that monthly service fee. You can have a pure ELD and support that local option. So I just kind of wanted to explain that to you a little bit.
Yeah, and then to follow up, so what that means on the inspection side is that you could be inspected in one state and have the inspector say, I want to do, I've got my USB device here, let's do that. And in the next state, it's going to be Bluetooth, so or the telematics versus web services. So when there's an inspection happening, there'll be a little bit of a discussion between the driver and the inspector over how that data transfer is going to happen, right? Because the inspectors have to be able to receive both the web type, the over-the-air type plus the direct type, and the device has to be able to do both versions of one of those 2 categories. And so, there are going to be some jurisdictions that aren't comfortable with the idea of a USB transfer. They're not going to want to hand a device back and forth. They're not going to want to plug state property into private property, whatever. And so they're going to go with the Bluetooth option or one of the telematics options. So it'll vary depending on where you're being inspected, what mechanism is being used. But every state is required to have one of both options, so there shouldn't be an instance roadside or in an inspection where the data cannot be transferred because the inspector is not able to receive. Now, something may not be working properly, and that's when you go to the fallback of either viewing the screen or the printout, and that's the fallback for every occasion. So it will vary depending on where you are, what type of data transfer happens.
Now, Andrew, as I recall from the May 9th event, you guys mentioned that there's a file validator that folks can use. I think it's intended for the vendors, but could the operators use it to test their own systems to see if their current system is actually either compatible / compliant?
It's not a question I can answer right now. It actually came up because we're working on getting that out. And it's definitely something that I think will be available to anybody, but we're going to finalize that over the next few days, actually, probably. So kind of who's going to have access to it, whether it's something that only the vendors can log in and get to, or if it's going to be a public system that anybody could get an export file from their, like registered ELD at this point and verify that the vendor that they've picked or the vendor that they're trying out, that the files that vendor produces are actually compliant with the rule.
And I guess I have a very dumb question after such a smart answer. Is there a maximum file size limit?
No.